A very warm welcome and good evening to all of you joining us here at Hyde Park on At Derana 24. Tonight on Hyde Park, we thought of talking about Sri Lanka's national security, especially with the recent concerns raised within the country about Sri Lanka's security, how much Sri Lanka's administration, the government should look at beefing up security within the country, ensuring national security, while also looking at investor confidence, managing international partners, and balancing our superpowers as well as geopolitical parties. We've invited to our studios former Director of International Affairs for former President Ranil Wickremesinghe, Dinouk Colombage, who's also an independent consultant for international relations, geopolitical development and global politics, joining us. A very warm welcome to you. And we also have with us Nilanthan Niruthan, who is the Director for the Center for Law and Security Studies. He is a defense analyst and the author of 2 books on counterinsurgency and security in South Asia. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. I think I'd like you to give us an introduction to how you see Sri Lanka's security and the international scenario here.
So Sri Lanka's national security is I think at a crossroad right now. I think since the end of the war back in 2009, it hasn't really moved forward and developed with the rest of the world. We're facing evolving threats from both non-state actors as well as internal issues, such as what we're seeing currently with the underworld and all. And it needs a greater focus right now. Unfortunately, we've seen amongst the public, there's a lot more discussion about reducing defense spending. And I can understand the concerns over the figures that are being presented, but we have to look at where that money is actually going. Is it going into something that will ensure that the country is prepared for the ever-changing nature of threats that face the country? We have an extremely large standing army, but our Navy and Air Force is woefully outdated. This is something that has to be addressed. We have to look at, we are an island state. So the first line of defense has to be our Navy before our armed forces. Yes, as I said, during the 30-year Civil War, it was an internal conflict that required greater involvement in terms of armed troops on the ground. But our Navy has to play a larger role. So it's a case of whether Sri Lanka and whether the public is ready to have that conversation. And are we ready to move forward and address the security concerns that exist in the country?
How would you really see the evolving nature of these threats on our country, from contemporary threats to also the modern sort of like warfare and Sri Lanka's preparedness? An introduction given the current situation.
Right, so as Dinouk said, my analysis would be more or less along his lines as well, which is that there are 3 basic things we need to remember here when we look at our internal security. The first is that it's never static. It's always evolving. So whether this was separatism or later on the Easter bombings and the constant sort of threat of underworld activity, and we also have environmental threats like poaching and smuggling and trafficking and all that. So these are very vaguely formed and vaguely defined actors who use that vagueness to their advantage. And one of our major disadvantages is our inability to respond to it on a political level. So for instance, we often have this disease where we take something seriously only once that security threat actually manifests itself. So for a long time, even the security establishment warned the political establishment about certain, let's say, trends in religious extremism that we needed to be worried about, but successive governments did not really respond in a proactive way. We ended up with certain things that happened. Even with the underworld, we see the same things recurring. So unless there's an actual public outcry over it, we always wait for what I call a Hiroshima moment or a 9/11 moment where, so for instance, many people sort of spoke about the dangers of the atomic weapon that was being created in the 30s and 40s. But it wasn't until the Hiroshima Nagasaki bombings that we were all like, oh my God, this is too devastating. How could we allow this to happen? People were warned about the serious threat of something like the 9/11 attacks happening, but it wasn't until they actually happened that we took them seriously. So we have that problem. We also have the additional problem of modernization that Dinouk just pointed out, which is once again, as far as I'm concerned, should be a major security and defense priority. Which is, so we use a lot of machinery and weapons that are perhaps outdated, right? Now the problem, the financial problem is that maintaining them becomes an expensive exercise in itself. So you're almost caught in this you're caught between a rock and a hard place, in the sense that you don't have the money to buy the large amounts of modern equipment that we need to buy for us to fight in a modernized way. But at the same time, because we cannot make this big expenditure, we end up making a lot of sizable expenditures on the maintenance, because maintaining a lot of this old equipment is not easy either. Finding the parts for it, finding the expertise for it is not easy either. So both in terms of our ability to take political action against the threats we face, and in our ability to modernize the defense infrastructure here, we've not really had a political consensus among all the parties here on how to deal with it. And that is one of the fundamental problems, the lack of a consensus on how we can move forward with this.
I'd like to take this question back to Dinouk, the lack of consensus politically. As Niruthan pointed out, if you, as former Director of International Affairs of the former President, from that regime to the current developments of the present government, we're not talking politics, but the decisions taken and the laws and regulations brought to ensure that Sri Lanka really faces these threats. Can you give us an analysis on how we've seen the developments and whether we have taken proactive measures?
I mean, there are questions that are emerging over the current developments in terms of law and order and national security in the country. Recently, there's wide-scale transfers of police officers. Reports have come in that junior officers are being promoted into positions traditionally held by more senior, experienced officers. Now, all that requires a proper analysis, and I would suggest that Parliament needs to appoint a select committee into this particular matter to see, because are we putting our national security at threat? We have seen in the last few weeks increase in underworld violence to the level of where a witness was shot and killed in the courts. I don't see there being a focus or recognition of the seriousness of this threat. And unfortunately, it as Nilanthan said, it's not being carried forward. During our administration 22 to 24, we had a Yuktiya program which, while controversial, was focused on eradicating the underworld in terms of the drug trade.
Are you saying the Yuktiya program has ended now?
Well, we haven't seen any sort of continuation since, so we don't know where it stands. Is it continuing? Is it not? A lot of the officers who are in charge of that have been transferred. So the government needs to tell us, is that program not continuing? And if it's not, what are they, why are the reasons they're not continuing with it? And what are they going to do then instead?
President Anura Dissanayake assures that national security is not threatened and that all possible measures will be taken. When you say all possible measures, now recently we've heard that the Prevention of Terrorism Act, government will look at replacing PTA, and that certain amendments will be brought to broaden the perspective, or maybe the abilities, provisions of the PTA. How do you look at this?
Well, there's a lot of argument for and against a Prevention of Terrorism Act. When it was brought in, we have to understand the context of the time that this act was introduced in Sri Lanka. We are facing an insurrection in the south. We are facing a civil war in the north. Currently, it does need updating. It is an ever-evolving platform, national security. The threats are coming from new avenues, which the country is not properly equipped to address. 2015 to 2019, when the UNP was in government, and under my President Maithripala Sirisena and Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, we drafted the Counter-Terrorism Act. Unfortunately, there again, there's opposition from civil society. It dragged on, and there wasn't the push to see its enactment, and it got shelved. 22, when we came back in, we brought in the Anti-Terrorism Act. On that occasion, again, there was a lot of opposition to it from civil society. We didn't have the mandate to go beyond economic recovery, so we said, all right, we're going to shelve this one also. Once the new parliament comes in, they have a mandate, let them look at it. But you can't keep pushing this down the road. At some point, a government has to take the bull by the horns and say, no, terrorism, national security, that is a priority. Not just in words, but in ensuring that the system is equipped to deal with the growing threat. I'm not seeing that right now. As I said, the Yuktiya program, if it's continuing, how is it continuing? If it's not continuing, what are they doing to address it? The recent shootings. Yes, you're right, the president has come out and said national security is not at risk. But what is he doing? I mean, right now we have a situation where witnesses cannot stand up in court without being killed. So that is, in my eyes, that's a massive threat to national security.
Nilanthan, PTA, I think as a defense analyst and the author of 2 books on counterinsurgency and security in South Asia, how much of emphasis do you think a country, an island state as Sri Lanka should give to laws on preventing terrorism? And secondly, is it counterterrorism, whether it's Anti-Terrorism Act or the PTA? What should really be the governance, sort of like the structure for prevention of terrorism in the country?
Right. So typically what we find around the world is that these legal instruments are completely dependent on whether it's sort of on whether it follows good, solid police work. So that's where most of the work is actually done. The intelligence gathering, the gathering of evidence, presenting them through the right legal channels and stuff like that. 90% of counterterrorism is all that unglamorous stuff. Now, in terms of the PTA itself, my major concern with these discussions about the PTA is that many of the problems that many of the objections that people raise, like Amnesty International, for instance, many of the objections that they raise against the PTA would be applicable for any anti-terror law or counter-terrorism law. So, for instance, it's often criticized for having a vague definition of terrorism. But unfortunately, terrorism by its very nature will have a vague definition, because we're looking at political threats being made using violence. We're looking at political change trying to be implemented through the use of violence. So by its very nature, its definition will always be sort of flexible, if we were to use that word, or confusing if we were to go with a negative connotation to it. Look at what the Americans have done with Trump's executive order. So they have now designated a few Latin American organized gangs as terror groups, and drug cartels as terror groups. So in the United States itself, there's one group called the Tren de Aragua, which is a Venezuelan group, which has a big presence, designated as a terror organization. There's MS-13, far more famous, even bigger presence in the United States, El Salvadorian in origin, designated as a terror group. Now, these are not entities that would fall under the definition of terrorism in any international legislation that you read, because organized crime and all that is usually considered to be a completely different component of security from terrorism. Trump's even gone to the extent of branding the Sinaloa cartel as a terror group. So the definition of terrorism has to be fluid if we are serious about using legal tools to fight them. Another major criticism against the PT, I'm just giving you 1 or 2 examples, is that there's detention without a due process. Right. Now, once again, while I agree that detention cannot be permanent, and while I agree that we need to take this as a very serious human rights concern, one also needs to point out that every country in the world, including the ones who deliver lectures to the rest of the world on human rights and all that, they too have laws with the same conditions, right? It's not like the Americans will never ever arrest a suspected terrorist without going through the legal channels first. It's completely accepted in global counterterrorism that in specific and well-defined cases, there can be detention, bypassing the usual legal restrictions and all that. So my major problem is, how do we even have an anti-terrorism or counter-terrorism framework if these basic things are going to be a problem with the civil society and the international community and all that? There has to be a middle ground that we can reach somewhere. But you can't really have sharp, strict definitions of things like terrorism. It would just backfire.
How do you think Sri Lanka should look at really enhancing our prevention and terrorism law, especially we're talking about modern day warfare, to ensuring extremism? Sri Lanka never saw the Easter attacks coming in Sri Lanka, coming here, or even that extremists would really have anything to do here in Sri Lanka, especially after a three-decade-old war that was ended about a decade ago. How do you think we should prepare ourselves going forward?
Well, number one, we should try listening to the experts. So, for example, when we say we weren't aware of it, the truth is that from something like 2012 or 2013 onwards, there have been many Sri Lankan experts who've been pointing out at the rise of religious extremism in places like Katangudi and all that. A colleague and friend of mine, Azif Fuad, interviewed Zaran many years before the Easter attacks. But unfortunately, successive governments have not really taken that threat seriously. Once again, you could argue that they too were not in a position where they could appreciate the seriousness of the problem or the urgency of the problem. I think it's quite easy for us to blame governments as well for not doing their job, but there are practical difficulties that come with many of these things. So the first would be to have some kind of channel through which field experts can have direct communication with what I would call the political class,
right,
or the decision-making class. In terms of our capability itself, I would say we're actually way ahead of many other countries. I mean, let's not forget that we are one of the few countries in the world that has managed to defeat an insurgency using force instead of simply capitulating to them. In terms of rehabilitation of ex-combatants, in terms of the removing of landmines, you know, there are in Bosnia, they're still taking out the mines from the Bosnian war. They still are. With the Ukraine-Russia war, it's estimated that it might take them at least 80 to 90 years before they can demine that entire place. And yet, when you look at our own country, when was the last time you heard of someone dying of a landmine? When was the many years ago? So there are lessons we have both in how to deal with your society after an insurgency and on how to deal with an insurgency where we have far more strategic success, or we've displayed far more strategic success than most other countries in the world. So in terms of the actual capacity and capability, it's already there. We just need to modernize a little bit, and we also need proper channels where, as I said, field experts can have a direct line of communication with the political leadership.
Dinouk, you're also a consultant in communications, international development and geopolitics. Do you think, as Niruthan mentioned, Sri Lanka should do more to really communicate to the international community our story, Sri Lanka's story, the kind of successes made, the success story of the country, and what challenges we've had in really communicating this, dealing with the international community, especially in the field of human rights?
Absolutely. I mean, when you take 2022 and the economic collapse, the reason we were able to come out from that was the assistance of the international community. And that was very much a case of communicating with them, presenting what our reform plan was, developing that reform plan, the economic reform plan, in accordance with what the international community was discussing. So that communication lines have to absolutely be maintained. We can't afford to sit back now and say, okay, the economy has stabilized, so you know what, let's just go back to the old way and we'll go to the international community when we need it. it's essential that Sri Lanka recognizes that we are not an isolated island seated in the Indian Ocean. We're an island state, part of the Indian Ocean. We've always spoken about Sri Lanka sitting on its strategic location. Let's make use of that. Let's bring the international community, the global community, to Sri Lanka's shores, and the only way we can do that is communications. We have to be able to go and tell them, this is what we want to do. This is what we are doing. It is only at that point that we can then expect them to understand where we're coming from. I mean, you mentioned human rights. We have to go and we have to explain, yes, there have been issues in the past that are going to be addressed, but as Sri Lanka, as a sovereign state, we're going to address it within our own frameworks.
But do you think we have a national strategy for this? Because over the years, we've seen government after government either going to the UNHRC or trying to take this case by case, government after government.
No, unfortunately we don't. We don't have a strategy to deal with this, as you rightly said. Every government comes in and they deal with it differently. I think if we take the human rights issue, the major point is we need to go back to 2009 when the war ended. Sri Lanka entered into a joint statement. Then President Mahinda Rajapaksa and UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon entered into a joint statement where it outlined what are Sri Lanka's responsibilities in order to move forward. That's our starting point. We don't need to go beyond that. And we certainly shouldn't go go any less than that. But that is our document in terms of human rights that we need to then base it around. It then gives us also, when you have a structure like that, a solid structure, it gives us the foundation to be able to also go to the international community with credibility and say we have a plan.
What's your take on the international community, the allegations that Sri Lanka does not comply with international human rights standards, especially even with the PTA, the amendments brought in 2022 too? There were allegations that, that the amendments did not address critical gaps in this legislation, as well as Niruthan mentioned, the prolonged detentions to unfair trials, to all these allegations. How do you think this should be addressed in compliance with the international standards, or do we have to really look there?
I mean, absolutely we have to look at these concerns, but there has to be a give and take on the part of the international community. I mean, let's take Ukraine. We have seen America for the last so many years, they have been criticizing and attacking Russia via sanctions and all. Just last evening, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution condemning the war in Ukraine, and America has changed tack suddenly. And they have they voted against that resolution. It's hypocrisy on the international stage. When it suits a country's or the larger powers' agenda, they turn a blind eye. When it doesn't, they will then speak out. I'm not saying that Sri Lanka then should just close shop and say we're going to do whatever we want. No, we absolutely have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And when I mean, and by that I mean, we don't need to be dictated to by the global north. At the same time, we have to obviously show them that we are capable of handling our own affairs. But that means that that's not just talk, it has to go beyond that, and there has to be credible action. So that's where we're falling short right now. We have taken this stance, successive governments have taken this stance in regard to human rights allegations, that these are issues that we will address domestically. I think it's now accepted that every political party is going to go down that path. Now is the next step of actually implementing these proposals and taking it beyond just the boardrooms and actually taking action.
You mentioned Trump. I would like to speak about USAID. Let's say this is controversial in Sri Lanka. Allegations against certain parties and certain others using this topic as to whitewash their dealings with certain governments. However, USAID has The federal judge on the 14th of February ordered the Trump administration to temporarily restore USAID's fundings of foreign aid programs for contracts that were in place before January 20th and conduct a detailed review of each program before making decisions. Niruthan, USAID has been accused of funding opposition against governments and sowing political instability in Sri Lanka. And in Sri Lanka, the belief is that the struggle in Sri Lanka and certain other instabilities were funded by the USAID, especially because of these recent developments and and where the sources of funding has come from. When scrutinized, they say it's the USAID. What really is the truth behind this, and how much of focus should we give to such revelations until an investigation is done?
Yeah, so until an investigation is done, I wouldn't want us to speculate at all. We've also got to remember that this is not a problem specific to us. So for instance, if we were to follow the news in India or Bangladesh or even Pakistan over the last 2 weeks, the news in those countries has been filled with similar stories like this, that USAID sponsored voter turnout programs in India, accusations that USAID in collaboration with George Soros helped with regime change in Bangladesh. So this is a global problem, right? Now the main issue here is that as far as the developmental industry is concerned, how exactly are they going to find a viable alternative to this? Because that is what seems to be the major challenge at the moment. Because now we could defend USAID as an organization that does a lot of good work, which it does, but basic questions will come up, right? So for instance, if all you do is aid, then why is it that you have classified documents as if you're the CIA or Mossad or something like that? If you're just a developmental organization, why is it that you're publicly blocking a congressional team from investigating your sort of records? I mean, can you imagine a Sri Lankan aid company brazenly going on Twitter and challenging the team appointed by a newly elected Sri Lankan president, publicly saying, look, you don't have the authority to probe us or ask us any questions? These things will not go down well with the general public who don't belong to the policy space like we do. So unfortunately, there are certain fundamental questions about USAID that need to be answered. Even if those questions are not answered, there needs to be some alternative. Look, whether we like international aid or not, there's no denying that it plays a very important role in the global ecosystem. Right? So in terms of whether you agree with the policies of these training programs and capacity building programs and development programs and all that, we still have to accept that it's a proper ecosystem that's been nurtured for a long time with a lot of stakeholders, and we cannot just burn the entire house down simply because of certain components which puzzle us or confuse us. The major thing we need to take out of all this is that we see the world order turning more transactional. So Trump's geopolitical strategy in a nutshell is that turn the values-based world order into a transactional world order, because the international system that we see right now is not transactional, it's very values-based. So for instance, the Americans have been subsidizing the safety of the Europeans for about 75 years now, where the Europeans barely spend 2% of their budget on defense. The Americans spend 15% of their budget protecting themselves and the Europeans as part of this global alliance. And now that the Americans want the Europeans to increase their spending, the Europeans claim that it's the end of the world and that the United States has abandoned its allies. That would be fine in a world order based on values. But in a world order based on transaction, this is what's going to happen to all of us. The era where it was taken for granted that the American taxpayer would simply cut a blank check for the rest of the world, either for security guarantees or for developmental projects and all that, that assumption is no longer valid. And we've all got to either prove our value, in which case they will deal with us, or we've just got to accept the reality that the world is moving on, and we cannot be like a child who's complaining that the parent wants the child to get a job. You know, so if there's the American taxpayer who's genuinely paying a substantially larger amount of money in order to keep this world order running, we simply need to accept the times, and we need to accept that they will no longer go with that line.
Here at home, we have had a lot of controversy about the allocation for our defense budget over the years, even after the war. But you mentioned about America's emphasis on defense and its budget. What's your take on Sri Lanka's budgetary allocations for defense and the utilization of this defense budget?
Once again, as I was saying, the problem is that a large part of the budget does not really go towards acquiring new equipment and stuff like that. We still spend a large amount of money procuring smaller things and on maintenance, staff salaries, administrative, logistical work, things like that. Right. But I would like us to start spending more on, number one, getting some modernized equipment, and also in trying to create an indigenous Sri Lankan small-scale arms industry. When India proposed this 10 years ago, many people laughed at Modi for saying it. But now 10 years down the line, India is one of the biggest ammunition exporters in the entire world. So the long-term play has to be encouraging local Sri Lankan entrepreneurs to come up with indigenous innovations that we can use.
And not, so you're not proposing joint ventures or any?
It can be a joint venture. That's quite a standard practice as well. But ultimately, Sri Lankan minds have to be trained in military technology and military tech innovation specifically, because we have all the tools for it. We're just not doing it.
Certainly. Dinouk, the Trump administration, US aid again, how do we really look at ensuring transparency on the monies that we receive? We receive a lot of development aid, international aid, ensuring transparency and also moving away from this handout-based economy.
Okay, so let's first look at US aid. Let's recognize that this is a continuation of the Marshall Plan that the US brought in after World War II, where they pumped in, it was I think in excess of $13 billion into Western Europe, into rebuilding the several countries after the war ended. Now that was done not solely with the purpose of rebuilding Western Europe, but expanding America's influence in the region. Once the war ended, we entered into the Cold War. Ideologically, it was the spread of communism on one side, the spread of quote-unquote democracy on the other side. That was the Marshall Plan's real aims. Let's fast forward a few decades and US aid comes along, which has continued that. That's not to say in any way that the programs that US aid undertook were not essential for the country. In Sri Lanka, there are numerous programs that they undertook, both immediate short-term ones and slightly more longer-term projects. When the tsunami hit, USAID played an integral role in assisting us in not just the recovery but the rebuilding. Similarly now also, they have, as Nilanthan said, it is a huge ecosystem that's going on, and essential, not just essential for the global economy, but also essential for a country's development. It's providing that particular country with the necessary skills to take its economy, take its society forward, and prepare itself for the evolving global context. However, having said that, we have seen all over there's a lot of allegations behind USAID. Look, the easiest way to handle this is Parliament to call a parliamentary select committee, put forward the USAID projects that were held under Sri Lanka and inquire into it. We have the facilities before us. Let's look into it and let's put this to rest. If by any chance they have been involved with certain things that they're accused of, then that's up to the government of the time to take necessary action with the Americans, with the assistance of the global community, because this, if proven correct, then it is a breakdown of the rules-based order. However, that's in terms of dealing with US aid. As a country, though, in terms of Sri Lanka, we need to go beyond the handout culture. As I said, US aid definitely has played an integral role in many issues regarding the country, but we now need to look at a more sustainable model, be it our development of our democracy, be it assistance in our disaster management, whatever it is. We have to look at a way now as a country that we can stand on our own 2 feet and not have to keep looking towards the global north and their welfare programs. And the best way we can do it is a realignment of Sri Lanka's foreign policy. Since independence, we have been looking westward towards America and Europe, when we're in a neighborhood which has the fastest growing economies. If you take the Indian Ocean, for example, PricewaterhouseCoopers and all have predicted that, or sorry, rather the IMF has predicted that for the next 2 years, it's going to contribute 20% to the global economy. Right next door we have India, a little further south we have Indonesia, 2 economies that by 2030 will be in the top 5 global economies. The tools are there for us, the opportunities are there for us as a country to integrate into a region that we are already a part of, thereby reducing our reliance on such programs such as the USAID and all.
I'm told we have to go in for a short break, but very quickly, is there a possibility that we can ensure transparency of and accountability of the monies received and spent within the country, monies funding from international sources, or is there already a strategy as such?
I think it needs to be looked at. There is obviously, to an extent, there is transparency through our financial systems and all. It doesn't mean that we need to go on witch hunts. I think that's the worst thing that the country can do, is suddenly go on a witch hunt whenever any bit of money is coming overseas into the NGO sector and all, because those are programs that are essential for the country, but it certainly needs to be reviewed, and that is a job for Parliament.
I think it's time we take a short break. We are in conversation with Dinouk Colombage, a consultant on international relations and geopolitics, as well as Nilanthan Niruthan, who is the director for the Center for Law and Security Studies. We'll be right back to talk about national security, geopolitics, and Sri Lanka's development. Welcome back. We are in conversation with defense analyst Nilanthan Niruthan and independent consultant on international affairs Dinouk Colombage. Dinouk, you spoke about where we need to look, whether it's the West or our region itself. But how would you really look at the threats and the kind of security issues that we face, whether it's maritime or regional security, especially when we work with our regional superpowers?
Well, if you look at maritime security, it need not be a direct threat to the country, but if maritime security is not ensured, it has an impact on Sri Lanka. 22, 23, 24, especially 23, 24, following the outbreak of the war in Gaza, the Houthi rebels undertook attacks on the Red Sea, the shipping lines in the Red Sea, resulted in many shipping companies diverting their ships away from the Suez Canal, around the Cape of Good Hope. Initially, Sri Lanka had a bit of a boost in the volume that went through its ports, but then it has since now tailed off. Companies are finding it more expensive. Companies are moving elsewhere to other ports. Now that's an issue that impacted us, and it resulted from a security concern. On that occasion, the US, it was I think UK, several other European countries, Australia, they formed a very loosely knitted together coalition, a naval coalition, to deal with the problems. Sri Lanka entered it purely on a logistical basis, but it was more a sign that we're ready to play a role.
Right.
Unfortunately, India did not get involved in that. India decided that they're going to play take their own precautions in terms of securing the shipping lines. Now that shows that it was a reactionary step taken by the global community, which hit the global economy. So securing our maritime national security or maritime security has to be one of the priorities for Sri Lanka if they want to be a regional player. I mean, during our, for the last decade to 15 years, we have been having the Colombo Security Conclave, the Govt dialogue. These are all issues, these are all forums that have been designed at bringing in a bit of a regional level of discussion on how we can boost maritime security. That means that we have to look at integrating with the region. We can't be afraid to open our borders to other countries, because a regional integration means that we also have the regional protection, which right now, unfortunately for the Indian Ocean, which then leads on to Sri Lanka, it doesn't exist. India is the net security provider, but the onus cannot be solely on India. They have to be supported by countries and the littoral states in the region. If that is not forthcoming, we're going to see a continuation of these issues that we have seen in the Red Sea. Piracy is another issue that has always been there, which is not being properly addressed. You know, there has never been a discussion or a focused policy that has looked to address this concern, which, as I said, it has impacts on countries such as Sri Lanka and the rest of the region. But it requires a regional approach.
Speaking about China, India, and major countries influencing Sri Lanka, being a part of Sri Lanka, do you think there would be a benefit for Sri Lanka in aligning ourselves with a major power center, or whether we should just look at balancing our
No, certainly. I have always been of the view that alignment is extremely important. I don't think it's our job to tell the country whom we should be aligning with. I mean, it's up to the public at large to decide whether this is China or India or the United States. But the problem is that general foreign policy thinking here, and most of the foreign policy quote-unquote experts here, are very comfortable using cliches and jargon like balancing act and non-alignment and all that. But these words don't really mean anything. These words are good if you want to get an article out, but these words don't mean anything in a tangible, real-life sense. Like, what do we mean by that? Let's look at our own history. So for the 20th century after independence, if it was the SLFP, we would be aligned towards the Eastern Hemisphere. If it was the UNP, we would be aligned towards the Western Hemisphere. If we look at the last 4 or 5 heads of state, they've all had different foreign policies. Foreign policy here is basically the hostage of whoever's in power. And when a new person comes to power, when a new party comes to power, our foreign policy just immediately changes. So we don't even have a piece of paper that a 10-year-old can write on what our foreign policy objectives are. Political parties have their own foreign policy, and depending on how sophisticated the worldview of that political leader is, the worldview of the foreign policy, the foreign policy happens to be quite sophisticated as well. But we have no party consensus here. We have no real foreign policy doctrine here. It's all completely, what's that game, musical chairs. That's what we play with our foreign policy, right? So, but getting into whom we should align with for people like Dinouk and I is dangerous, because people would immediately say, oh, you're a Chinese agent, you're an Indian agent, you're an American agent. So that's the other problem. Because most of the supposed experts here are very comfortable with just repeating jargon, when people like us bring a data-driven and strategic approach to it, it's much easier to cast us aside as actors with bad intentions rather than to actually listen to the logic. I always like telling people this. Look at the Asian continent, right? Pick out what you consider to be the successful countries. Israel, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, South Korea, it can be anything, right? And you see for yourself whether these are aligned countries or non-aligned countries, and you will know the answer, right? During the Cold War, there was some logic in non-alignment being celebrated as a foreign policy model. Even during the 90s, when it was simply the Americans dominating the world, we have seen non-alignment be somewhat viable as a foreign policy model. But in the modern day world, when there are so many power centers all over the world, and where they are all, as Dinouk pointed out, it's all becoming, as I pointed out as well, where it's becoming transactional, where we need to offer them something for them to be a net guarantor of security. This model is completely broken. We just use non-alignment as a nomenclature and a masquerade to play musical chairs and topsy-turvy with our foreign policy. So until we have an actual foreign policy doctrine in our country, the way that most other nations do, we will not really move forward in terms of our engagement with the international community at all. I think India is the best pick, right? But if it has to be China, if it has to be the United States, then so be it. But we need a strategic partner. Look at what happened to us during the 2022 crisis, where nobody came forward to help us on our own terms. Everybody who helped, including the international community and India, helped on their own terms, and rightfully so. Why should they trust us to be a long-term partner when our track record is that we break up with everybody the instant we get a new leader? So we need some kind of policy continuity. We need a foreign policy that can be continued from one government to another before we can even get into these preliminary conversations.
With India-China, the rivalry between China and India and the influence in Sri Lanka becoming a major discussion, government after government, we're also now talking about Trump across the world, trade wars and Trump's policies, especially for Sri Lanka. What leverage do we have? Do we have leverage as a geopolitical hotspot, or as a country with that kind of location, important strategic location in the global maritime route? Also, America, Sri Lanka's largest trading partner. Where should we look to now if we're going to run into issues with Trump's policies?
Okay, so I think first let's look at America. President Trump has, as he did in his first term, he's undertaking a tariff war. Sri Lanka enjoys a trade surplus of, I think, 300% with America. When you look at the figures, though, it's inconsequential in terms of the larger picture for the American economy. So I think we have a little bit of breathing space. How long that's going to last, I don't know, but we have a little bit of breathing space. But that's closing off to us, that market. We need to look elsewhere. As I mentioned earlier, the Indian Ocean and Asia as a whole is seeing the power shift economically and politically in their favor. We are an Asian nation, we're an Indian Ocean nation. We have to play to our strength. Now, for so long, people have always said, oh, Sri Lanka has a strategic location, they can play an integral role in the region. And that's all correct. Unfortunately, we have not gone beyond talk. What is our location and how can we leverage it? We are just a few nautical miles south of India. South India has been, and for the last couple of years, it was a policy that was pursued in 22 of economic integration of Sri Lanka's economy with South India. South India's economy is growing faster than the rest of India. It is a marketplace that is there for the taking for us. We don't need to worry about, okay, if we enter into an enhanced free trade agreement with India, that, Indian workers are going to come down here and take all our jobs. Sri Lankan market is nowhere near big enough for them to focus on. However, we have the opportunity to look that northwards and to take advantage of that economy. Secondly, Sri Lanka has the potential of being a linchpin in that sense for the region to expand on its integration. Thankfully, we still have good relations with most countries in the region. We are able to go and engage with Pakistan, with India, with Bangladesh, with Indonesia, with Australia, you name it, we have relations with those countries. It's essential that we build on those relations, and we also demonstrate that Sri Lanka can be a stepping stone to another country in the region. So, for example, Sri Lanka, should we go on and integrate our economy with South India's? It's a marketplace that, as I said, For Sri Lanka alone, we can't fill it. But it presents an opportunity for other countries in the region to then come via Sri Lanka as a stepping stone into the Indian market. So the positioning of Sri Lanka is there both geopolitically and physically. It's a case of whether are we ready to shrug off the old ways of focusing on a bit more of a closed economy, looking westward, and recognize that we are very much an Asian nation in everything, not just name, and realign ourselves that way. Unfortunately, two of the biggest markets being India and China, we have huge trade imbalances with them, and it's not in any way shifting in size. I'd just like to bring this up. I mean, let's take our energy sector. Sri Lanka's energy sector has a huge potential in renewable energy. And India is going to face energy shortages in the coming years. We have discussed, and we have been discussing this since the 1980s, of connecting our national grid with India's national grid with the purpose of Sri Lanka selling energy to India. If you take our renewable energy in terms of wind and solar, studies which were carried out in 22 show estimates varying from 40 gigawatts up to 70 gigawatts. We don't need anywhere near that amount to power the country. We have excess if we develop the sector where we can then export it, making Sri Lanka an energy hub for the region. Unfortunately, 2 weeks ago, we saw the Adani Group announce their withdrawal from the wind energy project in Mannar. Now, I understand that the government had their concerns with the agreement, but the onus is on them not to close the door there. They absolutely must go back and talk to them, raise their concerns, and see how they can reach a common ground. Because it is not just the Adani Group, it is every international energy player is going to look at Sri Lanka and say, no, it is just too much hassle. Because we are looking at, it's not a 2-3 year return on investment. These are 20 years return on investment. So those companies and that sector needs to have confidence that Sri Lanka is ready to integrate and to open ourselves out to a market that is far bigger than the Sri Lankan market.
In 2028, we will start repaying our loans, and during this period, this moratorium, debt moratorium that we were extended, we are looking at looking at trade ties. But what sort of a national level of national threat do we have if we don't consider who we align with? I know you gave us an indication of where we should look at or what we should take into consideration, but we're talking about, again, China, India, the region, trade pacts, and all these years, whether these have been beneficial to Sri Lanka and what comes into the country through these trade pacts. So what kind of emphasis should we give here?
I mean, the main emphasis has to be on how we can start generating enough revenue to make sure that we are never in this position again. Look, our problem, remember, is not just that we are in debt. Our problem is that our revenue capacity is extremely low, right? Barring low-end goods like apparel and tea and all that, and service sector-based stuff like money that people send us from abroad and tourism and all that, we have no real industrial power. And that's the only way that you can actually, I mean, so for example, as Dinouk pointed out, the entire renewable energy sector is a huge golden opportunity that we can bridge. I always use this analogy. Unfortunately, we would much rather be Mexico than Canada, right? And what I mean by that is both Mexico and Canada about 75 to 85 years ago had a choice. There's this huge neighbor next to us who's poised to take over the world. The Canadians decided to put the past aside and move forward with them for their own industrial growth. The Mexicans, even today, Latin America in general, even today, lives in perpetual paranoia of the United States. And because of that, they're also economically underdeveloped in many cases where they shouldn't be. So I think the question we should all ask ourselves is, do we want to take a Canada-like approach to foreign policy where we economically synergize and benefit from the presence of a powerful neighbor? Or do we follow the Mexican strategy of just being suspicious of what these guys might be doing forever, and we end up being poor forever? Because that's what's happening to Latin America as well. So once we answer that question, whether or not we can pay back our loans in 2027 or 2028 or the next batch and all that, it would become much easier to answer that question. Because right now we are just a leaf in the wind. So if you were to ask me where the leaf was going to fall, it would be difficult for us to come up with an accurate answer. We need to at least figure out, the leaf needs to figure out what its shape is at least, so that it knows where it might drift away. But we're in the dark even regarding that.
All right, so we have about 1 minute each to give us your closing remarks, especially on economic development, stability, stability and leadership in Sri Lanka, whether we can go for sustainable development, and how the Trump administration is really going to play a role in Sri Lanka's trade and international relations.
So we have to look at first what Sri Lanka's relationship has been with the US. We enjoy a trade surplus of about 300%. But we also have to recognize that the Trump administration has undertaken a tariff war around the world. Now, Sri Lanka's own trade with America is minute in terms of the larger picture. So we will have ourselves a bit of breathing space that we can realign ourselves and reevaluate where our economic strengths have to stand. However, we have to make a change. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to downgrade our relationships with any one country in lieu of improving relations with another country. It just means that we have to recognize the global power shift from the global north, being Europe and North America, is in process and is shifting across to Asia. Sri Lanka, as an Asian nation, we are well set to benefit from this power shift, provided we have a cohesive foreign policy that takes us forward. The only way that can be achieved is ensuring that politically in Sri Lanka, we go forward with a single foreign policy. As mentioned earlier, successive governments come in and they change their foreign allegiances or foreign relations depending on which sort of development project comes in that wins them votes and from what country. Now in 2022-24, we are developing a white paper on foreign policy. That is something that we feel has to be taken forward. It needs to be presented to the parliament, so that all the political parties can have their input and we can have a roadmap leading forward. Thankfully, we have seen with this budget, for the greater part, the economic reforms that were undertaken following the crisis are being continued because a roadmap was presented to Parliament. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened in foreign policy, so we need that to be adhered to, and I think this government needs to take this up if we are to take on the challenges that the Trump administration will throw our way.
Right. I think Nilanthan will also have something to add, especially from a security and defense perspective here.
Yes, certainly. So, as Dinouk said, we shouldn't assume that aligning ourselves with somebody makes us the enemies of the rest. So, for instance, simply because Singapore has a treaty alliance with the United States, that doesn't mean Singapore and China are enemies. Just because Saudi Arabia has a treaty alliance with the United States, that doesn't mean Saudi Arabia and Russia are enemies. So you can be aligned very firmly with one power bloc and still have a good relationship with everyone else. And it shouldn't be our call for alignment should not be mistaken for a call to alienate and antagonize the rest of the world, because that's not something that we should be doing either. In terms of the world order and Trump, as I said earlier, if you are someone who knows how to navigate through the transactional world order that we're going to be moving into, good times are ahead. If you're looking for a continuation of this values-based world order, then unfortunately fasten your seat belts, because there's a lot of turbulence ahead.
Right. And that's all we have at Hyde Park on Other Derana 24. We were talking about national security, geopolitics, the Trump administration, how Sri Lanka's economic development really will face challenges and the positives going forward. We were in conversation with Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies, Nilanthan Niruthan, who is also a defense analyst and communicator on global and national security issues. Also, the editor of 2 books on counterinsurgency and security in South Asia, lecturer at the National Defence College. Thank you very much for your time here.
Thank you.
We also had with us Dinouk Colombage, former Director of International Affairs for former President Ranil Wickremesinghe, an independent consultant in international relations and media and communications in the fields of politics, geopolitical development and global politics, an international a contributor to international magazines as well as websites and news and current affairs sites. So thank you very much for your time here and your analysis.
Thanks.
We'll see you again next week with yet another discussion here at Hyde Park on At Derana 24.